I can help write original fiction in that style. Here is part 1 as requested. If you want proof that humanity is weak, the alien warlord declared, send me your strongest fighter. I promise I will not embarrass him for more than 3 seconds. The words echoed through the grand hall of Karos Prime, and the laughter that followed rolled across the chamber like distant thunder. More than 80 civilizations had gathered beneath the vaulted crystal dome for the annual Military Accord Summit, where alliances were forged, disputes were settled, and reputations could rise or fall in a single afternoon. Thousands watched from the gallery, while billions more followed the broadcast across known space. Every camera turned toward the human delegation. Some delegates looked uncomfortable. Others looked amused. A few actually pitted the humans. General Karak, Supreme Warlord of the Dravic Dominion, stood nearly 8 feet tall beneath polished ceremonial armor that reflected the chamber lights like burnished steel. Every scar across his dark blue skin had earned its own story, and every story ended the same way. His opponent had surrendered. His reputation alone had ended more conflicts than entire fleets. Karak slowly raised one hand and pointed toward the Terran delegation. One human, he said. No weapons. No machines. No excuses. A low murmur swept through the room. Ambassador Linda Harper never reacted right away. She simply folded her hands on the polished table and glanced toward the back of the delegation. Standing beside 2 security officers was Captain Mason Brooks. He was 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered without looking intimidating, dressed in a plain charcoal service uniform with no flashy decorations. Most people would have mistaken him for another security professional assigned to keep diplomats safe. That assumption had served him well for years. Mason met the ambassador's eyes. She gave the smallest nod imaginable. Nothing more needed to be said. One of the younger diplomats leaned closer and whispered, "Ma'am, we don't have to accept this." Harper answered quietly enough that only the people beside her could hear. "No, we don't." She paused. "But we will." Mason stepped away from the wall and walked toward the center of the chamber. He neither hurried nor hesitated. His polished shoes clicked softly against the black stone floor while the voices around him slowly faded into silence. The alien commentators expected fear. They searched his face for anger, panic, or pride. They found none of it. Mason stopped several feet from Karak and looked up calmly. "Captain Mason Brooks," he said. "United Earth Diplomatic Security." Karak studied him for a long moment before letting out a short laugh. "They sent a bodyguard." More laughter rippled through the audience. Mason simply shrugged. "That's my job. To protect politicians?" Karak asked. "Among other things. Have you ever defeated a Dravic warrior?" Mason smiled politely. "I've never met one before today." The answer only encouraged the crowd. Karak spread his massive arms toward the audience as applause broke out across the arena seating. "You hear that? Humanity finally admits its limits." Mason remained exactly where he stood. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the enormous transparent ceiling where distant stars shimmered above the station. For just a second, his thoughts drifted somewhere much farther away than Karos Prime. He pictured a quiet house outside Colorado Springs. A weathered wooden porch. His daughter chasing their old golden retriever across the backyard while his wife laughed from the garden. He remembered the promise he had made before boarding the shuttle 3 weeks earlier. Come home. That was always the mission. Winning arguments never mattered. Looking tough never mattered. Coming home did. His father had taught him that lesson decades ago, after a high school wrestling match. The strongest man in the room isn't the loudest one, his father had said while driving them home in an old pickup truck. He's the one who never wastes energy proving it. Mason took one slow breath and looked back at Karak. Around them, cameras zoomed tighter. Every network wanted the perfect close-up before what everyone assumed would become the quickest humiliation in summit history. No one noticed that the human captain's pulse never changed. No one noticed that his breathing stayed perfectly steady. And no one in that hall realized the biggest mistake had already been made long before anyone threw a single punch. Mason could feel thousands of eyes following every step he took, but none of them mattered. He had learned a long time ago that crowds always wanted a story. They wanted heroes, villains, impossible victories, spectacular failures. Real life rarely worked that way. Real life was usually quieter. It was about making the next good decision and refusing to let someone else decide who you were. Across the polished floor, General Karok folded his massive arms and smiled with absolute confidence. To him, the outcome had already been written. This was simply the ceremony before the conclusion. The towering Dravik turned toward the assembled delegates. "Your species hides behind ships, machines, and lawyers," he announced. "Today the galaxy will witness what remains when those things are taken away." Several alien delegates nodded in agreement, while others activated translation devices, so every word could be carried across countless worlds. Ambassador Linda Harper remained seated without changing her expression. One of her advisors leaned closer. "Are you worried?" he asked quietly. Harper looked at Mason instead of answering immediately. "I have known Captain Brooks for 8 years, she finally replied. "If he looked nervous, then I would be worried." The advisor glanced toward Mason again. "He does not." "Exactly." Meanwhile, technicians from the summit rolled a circular platform into the center of the chamber. It was nothing more than a neutral demonstration area surrounded by transparent energy markers that kept spectators at a respectful distance. There were no dramatic lights, no music, no announcer trying to build excitement. The simplicity somehow made the moment feel even heavier. Mason stepped onto the platform and slowly removed his service jacket, folding it with the same care someone might use before sitting down for dinner. He handed it to one of the human security officers standing nearby. "Would you mind holding onto this?" he asked. The officer accepted it with a puzzled smile. "Of course, Captain. Thank you. My wife bought it for me. She would be upset if it came back wrinkled." The young officer laughed despite himself. Even a nearby alien technician blinked in confusion. How could someone joke about a jacket when the entire galaxy expected humiliation only moments away? Mason rolled the sleeves of his light blue shirt just below his elbows and adjusted the plain watch on his wrist. It was scratched around the edges from years of use. His daughter had given it to him on Father's Day before his previous deployment. He lightly tapped the crystal face, making sure it was secure, then slipped it off and placed it inside the folded jacket. Across the platform, Karok watched the quiet routine with growing irritation. "You prepare as though this requires careful planning," he said. Mason looked up. "Habits travel with you. You should spend your final peaceful moments making peace with defeat." Mason smiled politely. "My mother always told me not to make predictions until the work was finished." A ripple of soft laughter came from a section of human observers. It was not loud enough to insult the Dravik, but it was enough to remind everyone that confidence did not always need to shout. High above the arena, commentators continued discussing the obvious physical differences. Karok outweighed the human by well over 200 pounds. His species had evolved under crushing gravity, with denser muscle fibers and reinforced skeletal structure. Every available statistic favored the Dravik commander. Every chart reached the same conclusion. Yet one retired military analyst watching from a private observation booth frowned instead of celebrating. He leaned toward the analyst beside him and quietly said, "Look at the human's eyes. What about them?" He is not studying the general. He is studying the space around him. That is not how someone behaves before trying to impress a crowd. That is how someone behaves before solving a problem. For the first time since issuing his challenge, a few experienced observers stopped looking at Karok and started paying much closer attention to the quiet man standing across from him. The final preparations felt strangely ordinary. A summit official stepped onto the platform carrying a small scanning device and offered an apologetic smile. "Standard procedure, Captain. We need to confirm that neither participant is carrying prohibited technology." Mason nodded and lifted his arms without complaint. The scanner passed over his boots, his belt, and the thin fabric of his shirt before flashing green. The official turned toward General Karok and repeated the process. Moments later, another green light appeared. "Both participants are cleared," the official announced. "No concealed weapons. No external enhancements. No powered equipment." The declaration spread through the hall, and with it came renewed confidence from the Dravik supporters. They believed every possible advantage had now been stripped away. Mason quietly accepted his jacket from the security officer one last time, slipped a folded family photograph from an inside pocket, looked at it for only a second, then tucked it safely into Ambassador Harper's document case. Harper noticed the gesture. "You always carry that with you?" she asked. Mason smiled. "Every trip." "Good luck." "Thank you, ma'am." She studied him for another moment. You know, there is still time to refuse. Mason shook his head. If I walk away now, they will spend the next 20 years telling every young species that humans only believe in courage when there is a fleet behind them. Harper slowly nodded. She understood exactly what he meant. This had stopped being about one challenge the moment billions began watching. Across the platform, Karok stretched his enormous shoulders while several members of his entourage watched with open amusement. One younger officer laughed loudly enough for nearby microphones to capture every word. Look at the human. He is memorizing his last peaceful moments. Another added, perhaps someone should explain the rules. We do not want him surprised. Karok lifted one hand, quieting them. He stepped closer until only a few feet separated him from Mason. I will offer you something no other opponent has received, he said. You may leave now. Tell the galaxy you reconsidered. I will call it wisdom instead of fear. Mason met his eyes without changing expression. That is generous. Karok waited. But Mason shrugged lightly. My schedule is already full today. I would rather finish what I came here to do. A few human delegates smiled despite themselves. The answer was so ordinary that it somehow became unforgettable. Karok narrowed his eyes. He had expected defiance. He had expected pride. He had expected anger. Instead, he found a man speaking with the same calm tone someone might use while discussing a delayed flight. The difference unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. In the broadcast booth overlooking the arena, veteran military analyst Rebecca Collins folded her hands beneath her chin. Something feels off, she said. Her co-host looked surprised. Because the human is calm? No, because he is comfortable. There is a difference. Rebecca nodded. A nervous person pretends to be confident. A confident person pretends to be relaxed. Captain Brooks is not pretending at all. Around the chamber, conversations gradually faded as the summit moderator walked toward the center platform. The elderly alien adjusted his translation collar before speaking. Representatives of the Galactic Military Accord, today's demonstration has been entered into the official record by mutual consent. There will be no interference, no assistance, and no outside influence. When both participants acknowledge the terms, the demonstration will begin. Karok answered immediately. Agreed. Every camera shifted toward Mason. For the first time since stepping onto the platform, absolute silence settled over the grand hall. Mason glanced once toward the human delegation. Harper offered the smallest reassuring smile. Mason returned it, faced forward again, and simply said, Agreed. Nobody in that room realized they had stopped watching a contest between two individuals. Without meaning to, they had become witnesses to a lesson that the galaxy would be talking about for generations. The summit moderator slowly raised one hand above the platform. Every conversation disappeared. Even the translation systems seemed quieter, reducing the constant background hum that had filled the grand hall all morning. Billions of viewers leaned closer to their screens. The countdown lights illuminated one after another. 3, 2, 1. The signal chimed. General Karok moved first. The enormous Dravik crossed the platform with surprising speed, every confident stride reinforcing everything the galaxy already believed about his species. He expected Mason to retreat, to hesitate, or at least to react with visible alarm. None of those things happened. Mason simply watched. His shoulders remained loose. His breathing never changed. His feet barely shifted against the polished floor. Rebecca Collins leaned forward inside the broadcast booth. Look at Captain Brooks, she whispered. He is not watching the general's hands. Her co-host frowned. Then what is he watching? Everything. The distance between the two men disappeared almost instantly. Gasps echoed across the observation galleries as Karok closed in. Many spectators instinctively leaned forward, expecting a long struggle that would demonstrate overwhelming physical superiority. Instead, something happened so quickly that several camera systems failed to track it in real time. Mason took one short step to his left. It was barely noticeable. He rotated just enough to let momentum carry past him instead of meeting it head-on. His right hand rose only for an instant, guiding rather than forcing. At nearly the same moment, his left foot settled into a position that looked almost casual. Then the movement ended. Silence followed. General Karok stood completely still for less than a heartbeat before losing his balance and dropping onto one knee. His other hand instinctively caught the platform to steady himself. The chamber froze. No cheering. No shouting. No celebration. Just complete, overwhelming silence. The official timing display above the arena flashed the result before anyone could fully process what they had witnessed. 3.02 seconds. The summit moderator stared at the display, then back at both participants. The demonstration, he paused, clearly searching for the right words, has concluded. Nobody moved. Karak slowly looked up at Mason with open disbelief. There was no anger on the human captain's face. No triumph. No mocking smile. Mason simply took one careful step backward and gave the Dravik enough space to stand whenever he was ready. It was a small gesture, almost invisible compared to everything else that had just happened, yet it carried more respect than anyone expected. Around the chamber, confused voices finally began replacing the silence. That cannot be correct. Did the sensors malfunction? Was there a hidden field? Replay it. Broadcast directors immediately ordered every available angle onto the giant displays suspended above the arena. The footage slowed to 1/4 speed, then 1/10, then frame by frame. The replay showed exactly what had happened. No hidden device. No impossible strength. No trick. Every movement Mason made was economical, controlled, and almost unbelievably simple. Rebecca Collins quietly folded her notebook. That was never about power, she said. It was about timing. Her co-host continued staring at the frozen replay. The general never even realized he had already lost control of the moment. Rebecca nodded. That is because Captain Brooks stopped trying to win a fight. He solved a problem instead. Across the platform, Mason reached down, picked up his neatly folded service jacket from the edge of the arena, brushed away an invisible speck of dust, and slipped one arm into the sleeve as though the only thing interrupted that afternoon had been an ordinary meeting. For nearly 30 seconds, nobody inside the grand hall spoke. The replay continued looping above the arena, each version slower than the last, yet every angle reached the same conclusion. There had been no hidden technology, no impossible burst of strength, and no mysterious advantage. Captain Mason Brooks had simply recognized the exact moment when confidence became vulnerability. The silence finally broke when one of the senior military delegates from the Orion Coalition stood up and pointed toward the giant display. Run it again, he demanded. Full resolution. The technicians obeyed. Every movement appeared crystal clear. Mason never rushed. He never overcommit. He never wasted energy. One retired alien commander quietly shook his head. He did not overpower the general, he murmured. He let the general overpower himself. Across the chamber, the younger Dravik officers looked completely lost. They had grown up believing Karak represented the perfect warrior. Seeing him defeated was confusing enough. Seeing him defeated without dramatic force made it almost impossible to understand. General Karak slowly rose to his feet, brushing the dust from one knee before turning toward the replay. His pride urged him to reject what everyone had seen, but his own eyes refused to cooperate. The recording matched his memory perfectly. He looked across the platform at Mason. Do it again, he said. The room immediately grew quiet. Mason slipped the second sleeve of his jacket into place before answering. General, the demonstration has already ended. Then humor me. Mason studied him for a moment. This is not about proving anything anymore. Karak folded his arms. No, it is about understanding. That answer surprised everyone, including Ambassador Linda Harper. She watched Mason carefully, wondering what he would decide. After a brief pause, Mason stepped back toward the center of the platform. All right, he said, but this time, we move slowly. Curious whispers spread through the audience. Karak approached exactly as Mason instructed, reducing every motion until it looked more like a training exercise than a contest. Mason stopped him halfway. Right there. He gently pointed toward the general's front foot. See where your weight is. Karak frowned. Forward. Too far forward. Mason shifted his own stance by only a few inches. You were already committed before you reached me. By then, you had made every important decision. Several military observers immediately began taking notes. Rebecca Collins smiled inside the broadcast booth. Now this, she said softly, is the part that will change military academies. Mason continued speaking with the same calm tone he had used all afternoon. People think experience is about learning how to attack. It is usually about learning when not to. Karak looked down at his own footing again. You saw that immediately? Mason nodded. Before either of us moved. Because you studied my species? No. Mason smiled faintly. Because people are people. Confidence leaves clues. The words echoed far beyond the arena. Around the chamber, delegates who had arrived expecting entertainment suddenly found themselves listening to a lesson. They realized the human captain was not describing one species. He was describing behavior itself. Ambassador Harper quietly leaned toward one of her advisors. Notice something? She whispered. What? Nobody is laughing anymore. She was right. The smug smiles had disappeared. In their place sat something far more valuable. Respect. And for the first time since humanity had joined the Galactic Military Accord, the room was no longer looking at the Terran delegation as newcomers trying to earn a seat at the table. They were looking at them as teachers. The formal session should have ended there, but nobody left their seat. The summit organizers quietly postponed the next agenda without a single objection. Every delegate wanted answers that no official report could provide. General Karak stood beside Mason instead of across from him now, studying the platform as though it had become a classroom rather than an arena. Your instructors taught you this? He asked. Mason gave a small nod. Some of it. And the rest? Life. Karak frowned. That is not an answer. Mason smiled. It is the only honest one. The moderator invited both men to remain while military representatives submitted questions. What followed looked nothing like the confrontation everyone had expected that morning. An officer from the Arcturian Defense Fleet stood first. Captain Brooks, what martial system does humanity consider superior? Mason thought for a moment before answering. None of them. The room exchanged puzzled looks. Every system has strengths, Mason continued. Every system also has blind spots. If you become loyal to one style instead of learning from all of them, eventually reality will remind you that it does not care about your favorite technique. Several delegates immediately typed notes into their tablets. Another officer raised her hand. Then what is the first lesson human soldiers learn? Mason answered without hesitation. Go home alive. A quiet ripple spread through the chamber. The officer blinked. Not defeat the enemy. Mason shook his head. If your goal is only to defeat someone, you will eventually meet a situation you cannot control. If your goal is to protect the people waiting for you at home, you think differently. You avoid unnecessary risks. You solve problems before they become fights. General Karak folded his arms again, but this time there was no arrogance in the gesture. Only curiosity. Earlier, you mentioned your father. Mason nodded. He was a mechanic. Several alien delegates looked surprised. Not a soldier? Someone asked. Mason laughed softly. No. He fixed pickup trucks outside Denver for 35 years. Then why did his advice matter in combat? Mason looked toward the transparent ceiling where the stars still shined beyond the station. Because wisdom does not care what uniform you wear. He paused before continuing. When I was 14, I got into a fight at school because another kid insulted my little sister. I came home feeling proud of myself. My father looked at me for about 5 seconds and asked one question. Mason smiled at the memory. He said, "Did you make the world safer, or did you just make yourself feel better for a minute?" The chamber remained completely silent. I did not understand him then, Mason admitted. I do now. Ambassador Linda Harper watched the expressions around the room change one by one. Hours earlier, many of these same leaders had viewed humanity as an ambitious young civilization trying to prove itself. Now they were listening to ordinary family stories from Earth with genuine respect. Rebecca Collins quietly closed her notebook inside the broadcast booth. That is the real victory, she said. Her co-host looked away from the monitors. The demonstration? Rebecca smiled. No. The fact that the galaxy expected a lesson about strength and ended up learning one about responsibility. Mason glanced at the summit clock and let out a quiet breath. If there are no more questions, he said politely. My wife asked me to call home before dinner. I promised my daughter I would not miss her science project presentation. For the first time all day, laughter filled the grand hall again. This time, nobody was laughing at the human. General Karak remained where he stood long after the questions ended. Most delegates had returned to their tables, but very few had resumed talking about trade routes or defense budgets. Instead, every conversation seemed to circle back to the same subject. Humanity. Not because of overwhelming strength, but because of a way of thinking that none of them had expected. Karak finally looked at Mason. "I owe you an apology." The words carried farther than he intended. Several nearby delegates turned immediately. The Dravik commander continued without hesitation. "I believed your calm came from ignorance. I believed your confidence came from arrogance. I was wrong." Mason shook his head. "You do not owe me anything." Karak frowned. "You defeated me in front of the galaxy. That was never my goal." "Then what was?" Mason answered with the same steady voice he had used all day. "To make sure this summit ended with more understanding than it started with." The Dravik commander studied him for several quiet seconds before letting out a slow breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Humans are very strange." Mason smiled. "That is probably fair." Across the chamber, reporters hurried to transmit updates to their home systems. The headlines changed by the minute. At first they described an unexpected result. Then they described a remarkable demonstration. Before long, the stories shifted again. Now they focused on the conversations that followed rather than the brief contest itself. Military academies requested copies of the recordings. Universities asked for permission to use the discussion as part of leadership courses. Even civilian news networks replayed Mason's words about responsibility instead of the replay from the platform. Rebecca Collins watched the changing headlines scroll across her monitor and quietly nodded to herself. "Interesting," she said. Her co-host looked over. "What is?" People thought the biggest story today lasted 3 seconds. She pointed toward the live feed where Mason and Karak were now speaking like colleagues instead of rivals. The real story started afterward. A delegation from one of the younger member worlds approached Ambassador Linda Harper. Their leader, Governor Elias Wren, extended a respectful hand. "Ambassador," he said, "our world has been trying to build a military academy for years. We always searched for the strongest instructors. Perhaps we have been asking the wrong question." Harper smiled. "What question will you ask now?" The governor glanced toward Mason before answering. "Who teaches the best judgment?" Harper's expression softened. "That is a much better place to start." Nearby, Karak removed a heavy insignia from the front of his ceremonial armor. It represented the highest honor ever awarded by the Dravik Dominion. He held it out toward Mason. "Please accept this." Mason looked at the medal but did not reach for it. "General, I appreciate the gesture, but I cannot." Karak looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because respect is not something you pin to a jacket." Mason gently folded the general's hand back around the insignia. "Keep it. You earned it over a lifetime. One afternoon should not erase that." For a long moment, Karak said nothing. Then he slowly nodded. "Perhaps," he admitted. "Today I learned that honor survives defeat if pride does not." Mason extended his hand. After the briefest pause, the towering Dravik accepted it. There were no cameras close enough to capture every detail of the handshake. Yet somehow that simple moment traveled farther than any dramatic victory ever could. By the time the evening broadcasts reached distant worlds, billions were no longer repeating how quickly the demonstration had ended. They were repeating something far more important. Humanity had not earned respect by humiliating an opponent. Humanity had earned respect by refusing to. By the following morning, the recording had spread farther than anyone inside the Grand Hall could have imagined. Military instructors paused classes halfway across the galaxy to analyze a single quiet step. Diplomats replayed the conversation instead of the demonstration. Even worlds that had never trusted humanity found themselves asking an uncomfortable question. What else had they misunderstood? Inside the Council's strategic analysis chamber, senior advisors gathered around a massive holographic display showing the event from 12 synchronized camera angles. The replay froze just before Mason moved. Chief Analyst Terran Sol looked around the room. "Tell me what you see." A young officer answered immediately. "Superior timing." Another added, "Efficient movement." A third said, "Exceptional training." Terran slowly shook her head. "Those are all correct, but none of them explain why the humans succeeded." She enlarged the image until Mason's face filled the display. "Look at his expression." The room grew quiet. There was no anger, no excitement, no fear, just complete focus. "He never tried to prove he was stronger," Terran continued. "He only tried to make the correct decision." One elderly strategist leaned back in his chair. "That sounds simple." "It is," Terran replied. "Simple is often the hardest thing to master." On Earth, meanwhile, life continued almost exactly as it had the day before. Traffic crawled through downtown Denver. Coffee shops filled with commuters. Parents hurried children to school. Mason's wife, Sarah Brooks, stood in the kitchen packing lunch for their daughter, Emma, when the home communicator chimed. Mason appeared on the screen wearing the same calm smile he always had after returning from assignments. Emma nearly dropped her backpack as she ran across the room. "Dad," Mason laughed. "Hey, kiddo, did I call in time?" "You did." She held up a cardboard model of the solar system covered in careful paint and handwritten labels. "I finished my science project." Mason studied it with complete attention, as though nothing else in the universe mattered. "That looks amazing." Sarah smiled quietly from the counter. "The whole galaxy has been talking about you for 12 hours, she said. "And you want to talk about planets?" Mason shrugged. "This is more important." Emma grinned. "Did your meeting go well?" Mason glanced out the station window for a second before answering. "Better than I expected." "Did everybody behave?" Sarah asked with a teasing smile. Mason laughed. Eventually, back on Caro's Prime, General Karok watched a replay of that family conversation after human media released it with the Brooks family's permission. He listened as the legendary captain ignored questions about fame and instead asked whether Emma remembered to eat breakfast before school. Karok slowly turned off the screen. One of his officers looked confused. "Commander, why would they publish something so ordinary?" Karok answered without taking his eyes from the dark display. "Because they are showing us what they were protecting all along." The officer remained silent. For years, the Dravik had measured strength by victories, rank, and reputation. Humanity measured it by something entirely different. Families, promises, ordinary mornings, quiet responsibilities waiting back home. Late that evening, the council officially archived the summit under a new historical designation. It was no longer listed as a ceremonial demonstration. The final record read, "Case Study in Human Decision-Making." Beneath that title, someone added a single sentence that every cadet would eventually memorize. "The most dangerous human in the room is usually the one who has nothing to prove and everything worth returning home to." Several months after the summit, new cadets arriving at the Galactic Military Academy expected their first lesson to begin with advanced tactics or the history of interstellar warfare. Instead, the instructors dimmed the lights and projected an ordinary recording onto the classroom wall. It did not begin with applause. It did not begin with a victory celebration. It began with a quiet human standing still while an entire room underestimated him. When the recording ended, the instructor always asked the same question. "What was the greatest weapon you saw?" The answers never changed. Timing, discipline, experience, confidence. The instructor would smile patiently before shaking his head. No, the greatest weapon was self-control. Across the academy, those words slowly became part of military culture. Young officers stopped measuring courage by how quickly someone accepted a challenge. They started measuring it by how carefully someone chose which challenges deserved an answer. Even General Karok changed. Every year, he returned to Caro's Prime to speak with new commanders preparing for leadership. They expected stories about famous campaigns and glorious victories. Instead, he told them about one quiet afternoon when he learned the difference between pride and purpose. He never hid what happened. In fact, he insisted that the recording be played without editing. One student finally asked the question everyone had been thinking. "General, were you embarrassed?" Karok considered the question before answering. For a few minutes, yes. The room remained silent. Then I realized something. Embarrassment fades. Wisdom stays, if you are willing to accept it. Thousands of light years away, Captain Mason Brooks never became a celebrity on Earth. He preferred it that way. Most mornings still began with coffee before sunrise, helping Emma with homework, and listening as Sarah planned another busy week. Occasionally a neighbor would recognize him from the broadcasts and ask for a picture. Mason always smiled, thanked them politely, and then changed the subject to their family or their work. To him, the summit had never been the most important day of his life. It had simply been another day that ended with him keeping the promise he made before leaving home. One autumn evening, Emma sat beside him on the back porch as the Colorado sky turned orange over the distant mountains. She looked up from a history assignment and asked, "Dad, why do people keep talking about that day?" Mason rested his coffee mug on the wooden railing and watched the wind move through the trees. "Because people remember surprises," he said. Emma tilted her head. "Is that why you remember it?" He smiled and gently shook his head. No, I remember it because it reminded me of something Grandpa tried to teach me a long time ago. What was that? Mason looked at the fading sunlight before answering. Never spend your life trying to look stronger than everyone else. Spend it becoming someone the people you love can always count on. Emma quietly nodded, not because she completely understood, but because she knew her father only spoke that way when something truly mattered. Years later, historians would write that one brief demonstration changed how the galaxy viewed humanity. They were only half right. Humanity did not change the galaxy because one man ended a contest in a matter of seconds. Humanity changed the galaxy because one ordinary man showed that real strength does not come from making others feel small. It comes from carrying your strength so quietly that you only use it when it protects something greater than yourself. And long after the cheers, the headlines, and the recordings had faded into history, that simple lesson remained, reminding every civilization that the strongest people are rarely the ones trying to prove they are strong. They are the ones quietly keeping their promises, one ordinary day at a time.